Lili Wilkinson, thank you so much for speaking to Lovell's YA for your latest book, A Hunger of Thorns, which is your 15th or something?
18th.
18th. Oh my gosh. So this is very much, well, it's always exciting to have a new book in the world, but it's always exciting when you're nearing 20 actually. So first of all, congratulations on A Hunger of Thorns. I read it in about 3 days when I was meant to be doing all this other work. So that tells you exactly how enthralling it was. Can you tell us a little bit about A Hunger of Thorns, not just, just a plot summary, but also kind of how it came to be?
Sure. So I am usually a very like a plot-driven writer. I'm a very like a method-driven writer. I have, all of these very specific methods that I go through to plan and then write a story. And I did not do any of those for this story. It is a story about a girl getting lost in the woods in a quite literal sense. And I definitely got lost in the woods in the writing of it. I have been thinking about this story idea in some way or another, probably for 20 years, and if not longer. And it has evolved through so many different versions and sort of different iterations that I genuinely do feel like I have been wandering in the woods and sort of taking one path and seeing where it led me, and then picking a few flowers and herbs and putting them in my basket, and then taking a different path. And then, at the end it turned into something. So it is about, it's a fantasy. It's my first fantasy. And I do feel like I have been waiting 20 years to write a fantasy novel. It's what I've always wanted to do. But it is about friendship, I think, more than anything. I really wanted to pay homage to the friendship of teenagers. I think we spend so much time talking about romantic love, but I don't think we necessarily pay enough respect to friendship, and particularly that really intense teenage friendship. And so it's about a girl, Maud, whose ex-best friend, her childhood best friend, Odette, goes missing, and Maud goes searching for her in the hope that she can rekindle their friendship and save her. And it goes into an abandoned power plant that was built over an ancient magical forest, and some real weird stuff is happening in there.
I think actually it's a really interesting point. And I think obviously very different books, but I was thinking just what you said right now about friendship, and we don't pay a lot of homage to the very intense friendships that we have as a teenager, and also not necessarily acknowledging that that's not always a great friendship. Made me think of Road Tripping with Pearl Nash.
Yeah.
Which was, gosh, I love Poppy and I love her writing. Yeah. But it's something that I think I've only really seen done in Hunger of Thorns and in Poppy's book. But what your book does, which I think is really interesting, is it really read to me in a lot of ways like an Ars Poetica. So for those of you who aren't massive lit nerds like me, an Ars Poetica is basically a piece of work about the act of creating a piece of work. And it really, especially across that description of how you wrote it and how it felt, it really feels like a reflection of that. Would you say that's accurate, Lili?
Yeah, I think so. In many ways, Maud is the character who is not the most like me the way I am now, but is the most like me the way I was when I was certainly a child and also a teenager, but particularly a child. And I've always been a storyteller, it's the one thing I've always been genuinely good at. And I think that kind of relationship between storytelling and it really becoming a part of my identity, and as it is a part of Maud's identity, kind of sort of merged me and her together. And, I had those really intense adolescent friendships as well. And I was certainly very deeply engaged in sort of imaginative play as a child, as Maud is. And so I think that in a lot of ways, it is a book about storytelling and that love of storytelling and the kind of the power, I guess, that being a storyteller can give you socially and kind of emotionally as well.
Yeah, and the magic of storytelling, the magic that and this is, I think it's something that you can understand if you're reading, but especially if you're someone who's reading it, who's a writer themselves, that sense of bringing something, creating something and gathering the threads. As I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, no, 100% I understand this. So it's a really lovely thing, I think, especially for readers who are themselves, writers. It's a really beautiful thing to have that kind of woven, if you will, throughout a story as well, that in addition to the magic, the storytelling itself is a form of magic. And then of course we get that beautiful intersection. But I really really enjoyed it. And I guess the other thing I just want to pick up, because you kind of take that metaphorical magic of storytelling and you, in many ways, you do make it literal. Can you talk to me a bit about this being your first fantasy novel and how you experienced the transition from, thriller, speculative fiction, science fiction, to fantasy, and obviously realism as well. So yeah, how did you find that transition? Was there anything that surprised you? Was there anything that you really, really enjoyed? Anything that you hated?
I think that it's something I've wanted to do for a while. I mean, really, it's something I've wanted to do from the beginning. Like the very first book that I pitched to a publisher, at the very, very beginning of my career, was a fantasy novel, like a big, epic, beautiful, wizards and castles and dragons fantasy. And my publisher then was like, that's great. How about instead a book about convicts? And I was like, no, but that's what I did. And so quite a lot of my early books were commissioned, and I then, found myself writing romantic comedies for a while. And then I've wanted to write fantasy the whole time. And a part of me has felt like I read a lot of fantasy, and I read great fantasy, and it stays with me forever. And it is, you kind of absorb it and it becomes part of your identity. And then I read average fantasy and I forget it as soon as I have read the last page. And I didn't want to write an average fantasy. I didn't want to write a forgettable fantasy. I wanted to be good enough as a writer to write the kind of fantasy book that I would love. And I mean, I do love it. So I have satisfied myself, if nobody else. And so I wanted to be good enough. And then I just kind of got distracted. And in many ways, the thrillers, which kind of, as you say, a sort of speculative fiction, was my really quite intentional, probably more intentional than I've ever been in my career, like pivot to sort of move from romantic comedies through speculative thrillers and end up in sort of dark fantasy, as it were. So like that was quite deliberate. Partially it was because halfway through I pitched this book to my Australian publisher, Jodie, and she was like, great, it sounds great, we love it, maybe just do one more thriller. And that was the Erasure Initiative, which, I'm glad that she bullied me into that, because I do really like that book and it did really well. So it was right. But yeah, I'm really glad to be here now. And I think that because I read so much fantasy, because I've thought about writing it for such a long time, I thought that it would be easy.
Just going to pause and say I'm a fantasy writer, and so that is the funniest thing I've ever heard.
And I've also taught fantasy for a really long time. Like when I was teaching postgraduate students at Melbourne Uni, I specialized in fantasy. Like I was like the one supervisor that they would get for the fantasy students. So I've been teaching fantasy for a really long time, and I think I'm quite good at teaching fantasy, but I'm really familiar with it. And did I take any of my own advice? No, I didn't. I didn't work out my magic system until it was too late, and like I just went about it all the wrong way. As I said, I was lost in the woods. But the thing I will say is that I loved it. Like, even the hard parts and even the bits that I really struggled with, I loved every moment of it. And when I was writing this book, which was also a long period, and I wrote a lot of it and rewrote a lot of it during that first year of lockdowns, when the world felt so bleak and so scary, and we had a lot of real shitty family stuff that happened that year as well. And like, it was just a very hard year. My kid was in prep and we were homeschooling him through that year. So like, that was also just, it was a very, very hard emotional year. And every single night I would hop into bed and I would fall asleep thinking about my book, thinking about that fantasy world. And it was such a relief to be able to leave this world for a little bit and lose myself in that one, even though that world is also no walk in the park. But it was kind of lush and beautiful and interesting in a way that my house for eternal Melbourne lockdowns was not. So yeah, I did just love it.
I think also it's a problem that you can solve. you know, and it feels like you're like scraping away. You're like, the world is there. I need to figure it out. I'm not making it up. I'm figuring out the pieces of logic. I think Isabel Carmody at a Melbourne Writers Festival a few years ago, no, sorry, Emerging Writers Festival a few years ago, was like, I kind of explore the world. And she was talking about a novel she was writing, and she was like, I went around the corner and there were watchers watching. I was like, okay, so I figured out that there's like a surveillance component, you know, there has to be there's a mechanism behind there. I'm just discovering it as I go. And as much as like that is like in many ways like antithetical to me as a writer, I'm like, well, I have to at least have some sketch on the page before I dive in. You do also discover stuff, right? You sort of are writing and you go, oh, well, hang on, logically there has to be something here. Okay, I need to pause and I need to figure it out. And there's something really not just soothing, well, not just like satisfying about like figuring it out and like working through the logic, but in the context of COVID, very soothing as well. So that totally makes sense to me. I totally understand it. But I think what's really interesting is like, because I read Scatterheart when it came out, because I remember you were saying, because I was in your book group for the State Library Victoria, and you were like, my book's coming out. And so I was like, yeah, I got to read Lily's book. And I remember when I read Scatterheart at the time, which is now the rights have reverted back to you, and so now it's still available to buy. It's still out there in the world. But I remember reading it and going, there's almost like a fantasy-esque aspect to it. You know, even though it's not fantasy, even though everything kind of comes together, it's still about storytelling. It's still about the power of a story, and there is that like that fairy tale fantasy kind of aspect woven through it. So it's actually really lovely to kind of to know that this is in many ways like the fulfillment of what you've been working towards. And nice to also know that, and also, you know, it's funnily, it's an Ask Alice column that's coming out for this at some point, about the fact that writing is an industry. So you can't necessarily immediately write what you want, and you do have to hone your craft if that's not immediately your apparent skill set. And you build relationships with publishers who do ultimately trust you when you say, well, I've got an idea for a book, and you do have to make trade-offs. So there's a lot of stuff there that just like is really relevant to things that are moving in the world, but also lovely in your personal story. On the subject of you know, kind of the business of writing, I was really interested in the conclusion, in the acknowledgements. You noted that this had also been written with the assistance of some grants, which I thought was really interesting because we don't really hear a lot about authors working with grants or working off grants. A lot of authors might not know those are available, or it might, you know, it might not be accessible to them because they might not have the oeuvre behind them to be able to, you know, successfully apply for a grant. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit to that, because I think it would be a really useful thing for a lot of people to know about.
Yeah, so I am exactly the right person to ask this question to, because I have been awarded quite a few grants, but also I have been an assessor for a lot of grants as well. I was an Australia Council peer for several years, and so did several rounds of that. And I've assessed grants for Creative Victoria and City of Melbourne as well. And I find the grant assessment process really interesting. I quite like to do it. It always feels really good to do, to be, you know, involved in like giving money to authors. So it's one of the few ways that authors can get money that isn't necessarily for like just for the creation of work. And that it can give you the time and space to be able to work on stuff. So yeah, I had a sort of there were quite a few sort of smaller grants that came out during COVID. So I got 2 of those. One from the Australia Council and one from City of Melbourne to work on this. But the main thing that I had for Hunger of Thorns was I was awarded a State Library Victoria Fellowship. It feels very incestuous, as I did work for the State Library, but completely separate things, and I had been away from it for a while. So I was the State Library's Children's Literature Fellow for a year, but actually kind of turned out to be 2 years, because the person who was awarded the fellowship after me didn't want to use the office space, because you get a little office in the domed reading room, which is just so beautiful, and they didn't want to use it. And so I was like, what if I just didn't leave and nobody kicked me out and my pass kept working? So I just sort of sneakily stayed for another year. And that was when my kid Banjo was a toddler, and the ability to be able to like leave my mum hat behind and walk out the door and go to a completely different space to work on something was so invaluable to me, both for like actually just getting stuff done, but also for my mental health as well. Just being able to have that space to create where I didn't have to kind of juggle all of those things at once. And because that was for Hunger of Thorns, which at that point, God, was like 4 titles before that, and quite a different version of that story. If I had had a contract to write that story, I would have had to have written it in, 6 months, turned it in, and it would have been out a year after that. And it would have been a completely different book. And I don't think it would have necessarily been a very good one. And in fact, I may not have even gotten the contract in the first place. But that fellowship gave me the time and the space and a little money as well to be able to kind of allow myself to get lost in the woods, as it were, to allow myself to follow different pathways and different ideas and let the book kind of organically become what it needed to be, instead of attempting to force it into a structure that I don't think it naturally sort of fit into. So in terms of grant writing, if I could give some advice to people applying for grants, the main things that grant assessors are looking for is the quality of your work. So it has to have creative merit. You have to be, you have to demonstrate that you're good at what you're doing and that your idea is a good one. And obviously that's very subjective. And then feasibility is a really big part of it that I think not enough sort of people applying for grants can speak to. And it is very hard when you're an emerging writer. Like when you're an established writer, like I can just get a letter from my publisher and she'll be like she doesn't have to say she's definitely publishing it, but she can say, I'm definitely excited to have a look at it. And that's enough. That's feasibility demonstrated. And that is a lot harder when you're emerging. But whatever you can find, whether it is a letter of support from an agent or a publishing company, or, Creative Victoria, or somewhere where you've done a workshop or something that, where someone can speak to you and what you can do, is always good. And then a plan for the feasibility of your work. It's like, I'm going to write my draft and then I'm going to send it off to these agents, or I've got this schedule to send it off to these publishers or pitch it at these pitch things, like just to show that you've got a plan to try and get it out into the world. Those are really important things. People get really tangled up in budget. I don't think it's super important for writers. I think budgetary details is much more important if you're doing theatre or something where you have to spend money. Your living expenses, time to write is the only thing you need. Like that's like, you don't need to go, you don't need to go somewhere to do research. People often think, I've got to go somewhere, or like, spend the money on something other than just like food and bills. But food and bills is exactly, and childcare is another really important one. And if that's what you're going to spend the money on, then absolutely say that. But yeah, it is just about like, those are the main things. I think feasibility and just what you're doing is good.
That's really, really great advice, Lili. Thank you. And in terms of finding the grants, like, because there are odd little creative grants out there, like even one's local council often has grants that are available. Do you have any particular tips to find them, or is it just, I mean, you obviously, because you probably are more aware of things that are out there just because of your work history, because of, the fact that you're quite within the literary establishment. Is it really just a case for people who don't necessarily have that, who haven't worked for X number of years, you've just got to go hunting?
Yeah, partially. Places like the Australian Society of Authors is always a really good place. That your local writers centre will sort of collate a lot of those grants and sort of list on their websites or their newsletter or whatever, that they will have all of those listed. They're definitely able to be found, and there are organisations that, put them in lists that you can go through.
Great. No, that's really, really great. Thank you so much, because this is, I think, the most important thing about writing. If you want to do it professionally, if this is a business for you, Virginia Woolf said what women need to write and what anyone needs to write is money and a room of one's own. And especially if if you're someone who has other working responsibilities, or if you have children, or if you just, have a partner who's still, not in the office 2 or 3 days a week, like Alice, that room of your own can become actually quite difficult to find, let alone the money. So I think it's really great that we're having this conversation now. Final question, sequel?
Sort of. So there will be, I'll see you back here in a year, because there is a second book that is not a sequel, but it is set in the same world. So it's like a companion. So it is a standalone book. So if you haven't read Thorns, you can read this one. It's called Deep is the Fen. And it is also concerned with, it turns out all of my books have the same themes. I always get high school students asking, like, what are the themes of your books? And I'm like, I don't think they have themes. And then they're like, what about this, this, and this? I'm like, okay, so they all have the same theme. But yeah, also very much about feminism. And it is about a girl who kind of gets caught up in a secret gentleman's society that is kind of like a cross between like Freemasons and Morris dancers, but magical and evil. And they're called the Society of Toadmen, which is actually a real secret society from Scotland from like 200 years ago that I discovered in a book of folklore and was just obsessed with. And so, except the real version isn't magical and evil as far as
we know. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, it is an enemies to lovers romance with an evil toad cult, and it will be out this time next year.
I love it. I'm really excited to read it. I will beg, borrow, barter, and steal my way to a copy, and hopefully I'll even be in the country to be able to attend the launch, as I was not this year. Lili, thank you so much for your time, for your generosity, for being willing to share so much, not just about the process, but about the tips and tricks of the trade. It's just always a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm so excited for, what was it, a fen of...
Deep is the Fen.
Deep is the Fen. I'm so excited for Deep is the Fen.
Thanks.